45 minutes, 40 minutes?
About 40 minutes, I would say. Yeah.
Then we'll have questions for everyone, and then we'll confer and decide whether or not we can move forward and what we think of the paper.
Thank you.
You take
A very good morning to everyone, our panel members, ladies and gentlemen in the room. My name is Stefan Choo, and today I'm here to present my confirmation seminar with the topic of Tuned Inside Out, Mediating Engagement Experiences with Music on the Go. So before I begin, I'd like to dedicate this presentation in honor, loving memory of Associate Professor Stephen Miller, who sadly passed away from neurodegenerative disease, ALS, in 2013. Prior to which, he taught at the Yong Siew Toh Conservatory of Music, and he actually allowed graduate students from all different faculties to take this course called Sound, Music, and Mind, of which we talk about things like hearing versus listening, music perception, musical expectations, and that's what sparked my interest in combining music perception and learning with technologies. So, to give you a broad overview of the things I'll be covering today, one of the two research problems that I'll very quickly touch upon would be what shapes music experiences with commuters on the go and how does that relate to well-being, and secondly, how technologies mediate the relationship between the three. So a key theme of my presentation today is music moves people. And if there's any one thing to take away, this is the key message. Play the video. Okay, so now to give a very broad overview of my presentation today, as you can see, there are many different categories I'll be touching upon. This will be categorized mainly into research problem, literature review, method, timeline, and questions. And if you're a musician over here, I'd like you to think of my presentation as a musical movement with some of these musical adjectives for fun. So to begin, I'd like to highlight the gravity of the situation, that basically 14% of Brisbane's population of 2 million experience lengthy commute of one way of 45 minutes or more. And this is actually defined by the Bureau of Infrastructure Transport Authority in Brisbane. So as you can see, the issue is not just unique to Brisbane itself, but it's even worse in Melbourne and in Sydney. And of the different modes of commute, public commute constitutes 50% of prevalence of lengthy commutes. Now, the scope of this research would only touch on the-go, people on the go on commute, as lengthy commutes in one direction, including 15 to 20 minutes of travel on trains in Brisbane. So, one of the things that's most important to commuters is the time utility, how they use time in commute. Because commute is seen as an in-between activity, whether it's commuting from home to work or work to home on a daily routine. So studies have shown that people generally regard 15 to 20 minutes as positive time utility spent in commute. And this can be altered by noises or by the people around them, resulting from the perception of counterproductive time. And stresses arise out of mismatched expectations. So one of the ways in which commuters deal with that stress is by tuning in to music to tune out. So on to music, let us take a broader perspective about the importance of music in people's everyday lives. So according to a study by Supervisor, music is actually the third most prevalent activity in a person's everyday life. And that forms 10% of his activities in a day. So to give you, to bring it closer to home in the context of Australia, now 47% of Australians actually listen to music they own offline on a daily basis, and 16% via internet streaming. You might be wondering, hey, this might be people who are really into music, but what about non-musicians? Well, in the same study by Supervisor, for amongst its non-musicians, music over a 7-day period study constitutes 18.4% of all his experiences of music in all places, ranging from home to hospital to work, and it is actually significant. Now, bringing the context back to Australia, in Melbourne, a study has shown that 60% of young adults with the age range of 18 to 25 listen to music or radio while commuting in trains in Melbourne. So, what does that mean for well-being? Well, in a pioneering dose response study conducted by West Australia, it has shown that people who with a high arts engagement, be it listening to music or watching dance, will experience a better mental health. But what it means is, if you do the math, it averages out to 2 hours a week. So then there's a problem, because in engaging with arts or with music, the biggest objection, again, is opportunity cost, which boils down to time utility. But studies have shown how people mentally construe music, the physiological, the physical, the emotional responses that arise out of this complex network of interactions between music, the listener, the situation and context. And many of these studies, as we'll see in the next slide, they isolate 1 or 2 of these contexts, these variables, and study it, which makes it an incomprehensive or incomplete scope of a person's experience of engagement with music. Furthermore, these variables vary with time. These factors vary in time, so making it even more complex. To illustrate extant studies, how music has been looked at typically in traditional mentalist framework, music has been linked to causal goal reward systems, like major and minor music to being happy or sad. Some of you might be able to identify with this, but I believe quite a number of you have known about the Mozart effect, where music makes people smarter, and that actually comes from this paradigm. Well, some of the researchers have actually stepped away from this reduction. Instead, they chose to focus on people experiencing less, wanting to spend more time in a virtual place because of Mozart's consonant music, or having a resultant stress reduction. However, what is limited is that it's done in a lab environment or in a clinical controlled setting, which doesn't take into context of the context and the space and time around it. So what Clark says is that it's a mental reduction with only this to take into account of the mental and the social cultural aspects of it. However, we need to take into account of how people embody, react to music, physicalize it, using with the sounds in the environment, and as well as the psychoacoustics. So how people interact with music in the real world is they use music as a way to organize themselves around the space and time in context. And they do that by embodying movement in music through their bodies. This forms a direct mode of mediation, and it happens in the perpetual flow of space and time. Now, technology, as well as the context, forms indirect form of mediation. So for example, some of you might be aware of this haptic device, or like Fitbit and things like that. There's a device for music called the basslet, which actually transmits haptic vibrations of the bass frequencies of the music you're listening to. And according to empirical feedback from customers of the product, they actually feel much more involved with the music. So having said that, we need to rethink about well-being, instead not so much as a consequence, but rather in terms of how people embody interactions with music. So to do that, we talk about well-being in 3 layers. The first layer is what sociologists, the NORA, refers to as warm or embodied consciousness. It happens within a time frame of 0.5 to 3 seconds to non-contextual cues in the sound. It is pre-reflective, and it involves internal sensory motor processes that coordinate seeing, hearing, feeling. And there have not been many studies that have touched on this, but one of which that I'd like to just quickly surface is this researchers over here that looked at how people move, walk, and created soundscapes that have enabled them to become more aware of their body and the spaces around them, resulting in better kinesthetic awareness. Now, the next layer is what is called the reflective or referential layer. This is where people start to build in contextual knowledge of the music around them. And this happens in two ways. One is that there's inherent movement in music, as you've seen in the first video, which I'll be touching on again shortly, as well as expectations, recognizing patterns within the music. So these two aspects would be cultural norms, things that change with time. And because of the flux around it, and because of the subjectivity, and to scope this study, we have excluded that part of well-being in this project. So instead, we want to highlight some of the potentials of looking at the first two layers. Proprioceptive well-being, okay, so the NORA has studied a patient with severe burns undergoing a painful procedure which involves exfoliation of the skin. And the patient is very reluctant to treatment. However, when he is with a music therapist, he actually, instead of his embodied pain, by tuning in to the cues, the gestures of the music therapist, the synchronizing the beats, his attention is turned towards the music instead of the stress and pain. And one of the things which is interesting is multimodal feedback can actually allow that to happen, as we'll see in the video very shortly. And technology, for example, through haptic feedback, can distract the person's, through mediating attention in music, can mediate the person's attention away from pain onto the music. I'll show you in this video very quickly. Now, tune out will refer to a temporary dissociation of a commuter from his physical and sonic environment. Now, to elaborate on tuning in, you borrow the concept of affordances coined by psychologist J.J. Gibson. So, in the real world, an object will have physical properties that affords a person to perceive and enact his attention to it. For example, a hospital door without a knob would afford you to push on it, whereas a vertical handle with a bar would afford you to pull on it. Likewise, in music, such affordances come in the form of physicalizing movement through music. These attractors includes things which are within a music called endogenic, accents, onsets, offsets that chant the musical phrase, or co-articulators like legato that actually merges the boundary between one musical structure to another. Exogenic factors could include recognition of patterns for musicians, as well as linguistic associations or memory associations. And overall, this results in a feeling of musical prosody, shaping the musical phrase, as I'll illustrate with a demonstration. So, tuning into music modulates attention. According to Marie Jones, so how people tune into music, using it to structure their expectations of time, is they structure their auditory attention across time being varying events. Music allows them to structure time accordingly, because people have internal rhythms such as your heartbeat, your movement patterns, that synchronize with attractors in music, such as a rhythmic pulse. And strong rhythmic pulses regulate muscle activity and behavior. us look at some of the effects of tune-out that arise as a consequence. So synchronizing the pulse of music can cause people to lose track of time. Changes in expectancies can shift your perception of time. And this can result in altered states of consciousness, such as being a sense of weightlessness or being out of place. You can enter a state of flow, really enjoying the music, and certain peak experiences such as goosebumps or tears might arise out of your experience, and that leads to well-being. So, putting it back into the context of commute. Now, a commuter has certain needs when tuning into music on the go. For example, he might feel lonely, and by tuning into music, he feels companionship, less lonely, and he can tune out. It involves embodied reflexive interactions. If any of you here speak Spanish or Italian, you might be familiar with reflexive verbs like dormir, si. What I'm suggesting is listening is a reflexive verb. It's ascoltarsi. Commuters, listening might not just be in the background. People might actually play a very active process in tuning into tune-out. Research has shown that commuters want to sustain the auditory bubble against background noise, and therefore some of them actually use headphones or they use volume control, and it shows an increased involvement. Now, this will be clear in a minute as I talk about how people embody interactions with music. So within music, there are attractors, like the pulse of music. So people synchronize with music through movement, such as head nodding, foot tapping, and these are the direct forms of mediated engagement with the music, or using gestures at piano. It also involves forward sensory motor processes, like accentuating that foot tapping in line with the pulse of music, or using the headphones as a control. Then comes the next part, which is links to the reflective aspects of that experience in what is called kinesthetic transformation. So this takes a person out of context of being in the flow with music, involves the triggering of episodic memories, visualization, etc. Now, technology will play an indirect role in terms of mediating the quality of the involvement, of the engagement. These three qualities include causality, presence, and flow. So, presence in music is a state of being there. So it includes two components: involvement, being involved in the music, which means it involves the extent of forward sensory motor participation, as well as the inverse sensory motor participation. And virtual reality technology such as VR is known to increase involvement in music. Now, immersion, on the other hand, represents a continuous, the commuter can perceive a continuous stream of information. It also means that it relates to the effectiveness of tuning in to tune out. So interface issues can cause a person to feel less present in the music, or proprioceptive stimulation via a haptic device could increase the feed-forward sensory motor involvement in the music. Now, causality comes twofold. It can either come from sources in the music, for example, a prominent violin line or a vocal line arising from an orchestra, or the conductor's gestures. And certain modalities such as you watching the video together with listening actually allows people to listen in search to locate the cause of the music. The other side of it is external events. Technology, for example, VR, can cause motion sickness, a form of causality, because the person is stationary, but the VR environment is moving. Other expected modes of causality could involve train announcements that pull the attention of the commuter away from the music. Flow, on the other hand, represents a state of complete immersion. How a person matches his skills with the challenges in the music, and how it's a coupling of how the person navigates music using the technology. It cannot be directly probed at the start, but we can observe the consequences of which. So, like for example, the physiological reactions like goosebumps and tears. So, this is a summary slide outlining the relations of tuning in to well-being through embodiment. As I've mentioned earlier, the synchronization and gestures, they form the what aspects of how people engage with music. Whereas the indirect technology mediators arising from technology and the context would form the how aspects of the experience. So then it goes through the proprioceptive semantics, how people move to the events in the music, and how it affects proprioceptive consciousness and well-being. When they reflect on it, they try to make sense of the movement, and it is where they use embodied metaphors. For example, whether it's rising or falling, whether it's heavy or light, and some of these are described by Laban using the relating to the Laban movement categories, effort and shape. That's how they form meaning and engagement with music. So having said that, let us go back to the research problem. What aspects of music shapes commuters' experiences while on the go with technology, and how can technology mediate that engagement? So of which we are interested in looking at Western classical music, train commute embracement, and the sense of well-being, embodied security mediated by technologies. So in research question 1, we want to find out what shapes commuter experiences with music on the go, linking salient passages of music with their proprioceptive as well as reflective experiences. And in research question 2, we want to understand how technologies can mediate those embodied experiences for well-being on the go. The research questions would still need to be tightened up, and that's where I'll be happy to have advice from the panel members. Now, on to the research significance. As I mentioned earlier, we want to address the specifics of dose response coming out of an earlier study by West Australia. And we want to complement extant growing bodies of knowledge in ecological embodied music cognition in literature. In the field of design, it comes in the form of new interfaces for musical expression, and in musicology or music psychology, it comes in the form of musica scientific or music perception. Then it can inform the adaptation or design of wearable music devices, and this is done through collaboration between railway network operators, technology developers, orchestras, and musicians, and it will involve from our side development of an interactional model that describes this embodied proprioceptive and reflective experiences to well-being in music on the go. And just to highlight, to give you a little bit more visualization of the possibilities, one of these researchers over here has actually realized that having this armband that simulates muscle activity in VR increases the sense of realism in navigating the VR space. So, for our research methodology, we pivot on tuning in to tune out to understand how commuters embody interactions with music through portable music devices and present momentary experiences on the go. To address research question 1, we want to understand the mediators of attention in tuning in to tune out, the proprioceptive movements in tuning in to tune out, and then to their reflective experiences of which. Then we want to investigate the common and contrasting attractors between audio and haptic, and visual couplings. This will address research question 1, and feed into research question 2, where we want to form recommendations for the design adaptation of portable music devices, and an interactional model that relates proprioceptive and reflective aspects of their well-being. To do so, this is the research design that we employ. First, we record movements and physiological responses in engagement with music. And these are universal. It's an objective way of knowing a person's proprioceptive experience. Then we looked at relate the movements and physiological reactions to the mediators. Then from there, and to the appropriate salient segments of music. From there, we want to understand how they derive meaning using reflective accounts, probing them through interviews using labile movement analysis metaphors. Then we want to deduce the quality of participants' use of music on the go via the mediators of causality, presence, and flow. And all in all, synthesize what constitutes mediated engagement experiences with music on the go. So to break it down a little bit further, let me elaborate. So for our observations, we're going to employ video recorded observations on Queensland trains. So to record synchronization, we look at things like repetitive, repeated movements such as head nodding, foot tapping, gestures such as tracing, and indirect mediators such as causality, but accentuated head movements, jerky movements. So this would be an indicator, for example. And to give you a visualization of the experimental setup, the passenger will be seated in the direction of train travel with the researcher facing the participant and holding a portable camera that will record the scope of participant as shown in the figure on the right. Queensland Rail and TransLink train networks permissions have been provisionally obtained to conduct these visual recorded observations. Yay! Okay. So yeah, then from there, once we've done that, we'll do some thematic analysis, matching the movements to certain sonic segments of the music. And finally, invite them to the past lab, people and systems lab to conduct retrospective interviews. This would involve probing further into the respective mediators. For example, causality. We want to identify what caused them to perform that particular movement. Is it the technology, the music, or the environment? Just to highlight. Now, moving on, we talk about the participants. 2 groups of participants will be selected. The first group will involve musicians. So generally, it would entail people from participants ranging from undergraduate students enrolled in the conservatory to performing musicians, preferably trained in Western musical conventions. Group 2 involve people who can range from people who are amateurs, students, working professionals. They do not need to have any prior musical knowledge. The rationale of which is important, because in a study by Mark Lehman, which entails sound, action, perception couplings, he has found that people who are music training, they are more predisposed and pre-inclined to move to a greater degree, extent, and also to be more accurate in predicting the next movement as compared to non-musicians who are a little bit more tentative. However, the type of movements that they exhibit and the reflection of the movements is the same. So if participants from this group feel that it's heavy, the same research shows that the participants over here, they were like to they articulated their experiences as heavy as well. What is important is these participants must not be averse to the choice of music used in the experiment, because in a study by Yuslin et al. In 2011, he has found that people who are very vocal, averse to music, they actually deliberately inhibit their involvement in music. The top-down, they form narratives that drive all the way down to suppress their proprioceptive and reflective experiences in music. And that's one of the limitations that we want to avoid touching upon. We acknowledge that there will be these limitations. Phase 1 would include the use of a headphone for the study. It will take 5 to 6 months, including a preparatory stage of 1 to 2 months. Phase 2 would include, on top of the headphones, the bracelet. And phase 3 would be the headphones, the bracelet, and then the VR headset. The reason for which is because it has already been documented in extant knowledge that proprioceptive feedback increases immersion in VR. So in summary, the research aims towards synthesis of mediators in tuning in to tune out, thereby mediating a commuter's consciousness or well-being, embodied well-being. This would include development of an interactional model that relates proprioceptive and reflective experiences with engaging with music on the go to his well-being. And this is the expected timeline of the study. Moving on from this point onwards, we expect myself to get familiarized with Laban movement analysis and spectrogram analysis. So there's some learning on my part. And also we need to get selection of music and approval processes, because we're intending to use music that already exists as a VR in the VR platform across all 3 studies. And that would likely be Beethoven's 9th. Now, each of these would take about a year, 9 months to a year. Each of them, and you can see that they cascade pretty nicely up to the 30th month. And what's possibly next in terms of academic outputs was I was actually thinking of attending international summer music school in Oslo, but unfortunately they're not offering it this year. But there's this audio mostly conference which focuses on sound immersion and emotion, and the deadline for submissions will be 10th of May 2018. With that, I'll leave you with 3 billboards inside the train station. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Do we have any questions from the panel first? Yeah, Markus?
Sure. So thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. I said it's the first time I actually had a live performance in any seminar, so that's great. That's very good.
Thank you.
Very good. So I've got a few comments. The first one is sort of going back right to the start and to the motivation of the thesis. So it's very clear that you have a very extensive knowledge of music theory, and that sort of comes through, and that's sort of very clear. What I'm wondering is sort of how the setting is motivated, and in terms of the commuter train. So my first question is one about scope, because you're referring your research questions to music on the go, but that could be music on the go while walking. It could be music on the go generally. When you refer to public transport, which is not just train, it could be buses or other modes of public transport. So you've chosen trains, which could be a pragmatic choice, because obviously you have to do your studies somewhere, but I feel that that would have to be motivated a bit more, sort of, what is the overall scope, what attracted you to trains compared to buses, just to set the overall context of, where you're working a bit more, I think.
Right, that's a good question. Yeah. And one of the first considerations that I had was the use of VR. I wanted, right from the start, I was very curious about how VR can increase a person's immersion in music. So I find personally experiencing buses that can be very bumpy, not very stable, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to. It could be a future study of people having music devices on the go on buses or on aeroplanes, but trains at least provide that stable platform. And secondly, I noticed that train commute here it can take up to 2-3 hours depending on where you go, like to Sunshine Coast or to Gold Coast. And I think that forms a very good context for study.
Yes, that's great. So I think highlighting that would probably be useful in your motivation.
Okay.
So really sort of set the context a bit more. The other thing I noticed that some of the literature around sort of use of music on public transport is a little bit old, sort of on the old side, so from 2001, 2007. That's sort of a time, before people actually had things like iPhones, and applications and so on. So while I understand that sort of the music theory has been around for a while, so that's totally valid to use sort of older literature. But do you have any new literature that looks at how people use more modern devices in Commute, so in sort of combination of music and the use of apps, which is probably something that's very common.
Well, that is a good point. I think I have looked into that, but probably I could do a little bit more work in that. Based on what I had found previously, the most recent one would be the study in Melbourne, looking at people using mobile phones on trains. And that's where I thought it's very appropriate because it sets a context in Australia and highlights the people feeling stressed on public commute, such as train commute, and needing the use of technologies, not just music, but chat text messages or playing with apps on trains. And music forms a substantial part of it.
Yeah.
Finding the, because initially I did look at other literature, but the discussion was that it's not oriented to the context of Australia. So finding that relevant literature in Australia proved to be a little bit challenging.
Okay, but I think it's just, even if it's worldwide, I think the Australian context is great, but I think it could be argued that the context of commuting in London and commuting in Australia has a lot of similarities. So I don't know that it necessarily needs to be something that's relating to the Australian context. It's just that if I read a motivation as a reviewer of a thesis, I know you're not there yet, but once you're there, having sort of literature that's from 2001 and talks about music players, I think about MP3 players and people only listen to music. So I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, I remember that there was a literature.
I might see that we get more of a chance.
Yeah.
You guys have questions or more?
No, you go.
One thing which is related to that, I think, is just, and I know you have touched on it, and it's a little bit in the document as well, but maybe to just maybe have a little bit more around just music while moving in general. I think would it was something that you mentioned here, and I know you kind of skipped over because of time and other reasons, but just generally speaking, I think maybe digging into a little bit more around, because there is a lot of literature around, and some of them might not relate, and you can skip over some of that really quickly, but I think there's other literature around just the way that people engage with music while traveling, walking, on other types of transports, while traveling internationally and things like that. We'll give some sort of background and some assistance to some of the concepts and things that you're talking about. And it doesn't have to be, as Markus said, within Australia, within
Actually,
a train setting.
Actually, there were some studies like music and walking, but it looked at it from a cognitive mentalist point of view. That's also one of the reasons why I didn't want to have too much repetition in the document. Just wanted to serve it as a background. Yes.
No, I know you've done a fair bit of it in terms of the document.
Okay.
It didn't come through maybe as much on the presentation. That's all.
Okay, sure.
So
Noted.
I do have one question. Not a question, is a request. Can you explain a little bit more about the number of your participant pool? Why 10 and 10? Why not more or less? Can you explain? Because obviously due to time you didn't talk about that.
Right.
Short reference to
Okay,
that.
so we'll be doing an exploratory study, and the music that we're going to use is probably at least 15 to 20 minutes long. We expect we're getting very rich interview data that forms about how people move and how they derive their experiences from which. Then when it comes to the analysis, it is likely that we'll have a timeline sort of comparison, like say using headphones, you are moving from say 10 in one chunk, maybe 2 minutes or 1 minute. Using haptic device, maybe it's 3 minutes. Maybe all three combined, the attention span is 5 minutes. So that's something which could develop as this project goes along. We envision a lot of rich qualitative data to come from it.
Does anyone in the audience have questions?
Stefan, I'm just wondering, how do you select your participants based on occupation or any demographics?
So how I select participants would be basically, I'll go through, for example, for musicians, I'll likely get the help of the department as to forward emails to say Griffith University, as well as UQ, because they have a music school in both universities, as well as at QT, I'm not so sure because they seem to be more into contemporary music, so we're not excluding that. So those are some of the avenues. Through word of mouth, I have musician friends as well. We're not expecting a large number. Then as for the non-musicians, there are some people who listen to music on a daily basis or for well-being. And I have friends who are very much into yoga, personal health, and very conscious about their well-being. And that's one area which I hope this project would indirectly benefit them.
Anyone else have questions?
Thank you, Stefan. It was a lovely presentation, a really lovely inspiration for your work in this area. I have two main points that I'd like to make. One is, have you considered using the concept of entrainment as a theoretical basis, because it can unite all these sort of separate ideas about embodiment. So entrainment, it's drawing on, sort of stemming from Murray Rhys-Jones' ideas in dynamic attending theory, that we synchronize our attention, which can flow through to a covert and overt movement, to the external rhythmic signals in the environment. So if we're tuning into music, we would hypothesize that we would see a tuning in of our neural oscillations, perhaps stemming through to overt body movement that matches or correlates with the music that we're listening to more so than other external stimuli in the environment. That's just something to think of.
Right.
The other comment that I wanted to make was in relation to the choice of music, because we know that people have their strongest emotional reactions and even as a lay therapeutic practice, use music purposely to change, to regulate mood and emotion. What works for one person may not work for somebody else, so it's highly individualized. And I just wonder, would you get stronger results by enabling people to listen to their own preferred music?
Right. That is a good question. I have thought about that. Like getting people to listen to their own music. But one of the things which comes about in terms of synthesizing for design recommendations is I wanted to pick out the narrative, because it also involves some kind of mood and motion, involves narrative consciousness, the liking, that's being happy or sad, the associations to their friends and family around them. And that's something which I find it would be difficult might be challenging to translate into design recommendations. Instead, using one source which is sort of common, I wouldn't say really mainstream, but something which people can identify with, Beethoven's Ninth. We form a use case that can inform people who want to, at least it can, if orchestra makers, they want to use Beethoven Ninth, they know how to adapt it to the devices and so forth.
Well, if you are going to be prescriptive in the sort of music that you choose, you select for people to listen to, it may be worthwhile including a variety of pieces of music, so that it's not just tied to your results. If you only have one piece of music, might then just be tied to that particular piece of music. So you want to cover a number of bases, mode, tempo, complexity, all of those. And just sort of following on from that sort of stimulus type point of view, have you seen the apps that are out there that exist for that draw on people's own playlists to create a playlist to move them from one mood or emotion through to another one over a period of time? The one I can think of, Will Randall, who was in Melbourne, developed it. He's now in, I think it's Vascular in Finland, called the Psych app.
Sounds a little
PSYCH.
There was one developed by some researchers here called
There
Music
was.
Escape.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And it uses, so Spotify codes music
Yeah.
to emotion, so it uses the Spotify coding scheme. But Music Escape, Oksana is in the School of Design.
Yeah. Yes, I'm familiar with that one too, yeah.
Right. That definitely would be something would be of interest to look into as we develop. But what draws my attention right now would be things like, for example, the Myo armband that's developed by Mark Lehman and his team that records the muscle activity of participants and translates it into gestures, because that addresses the proprioceptive aspects of their experience. Yeah.
Any other questions? We might wrap up the questions there then. Thank you very much. The next stage is we might ask everyone to thank you for coming and hang out with Stefan while he waits anxiously, and we'll confer. Don't go too far. Oh, do you have another question?
I do have a quick.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was waiting. I thought you were addressing the audience. Just in terms of, I want to have a few questions around your study methodology. The first one is around the observational study, and specifically around the way that you videotape your participants.
Okay.
I mean, there is sort of a question around how intrusive certain study methods are. So, you're clearly taking the study into the wild, so you're conducting the experiment in the train, which is great to see. But at the same time, you have somebody sitting opposite you with a video camera filming you. So, if I'm thinking about people being self-conscious, listening to music, but being asked to relax and just tune everything out, having somebody sitting there with a video camera in your face might actually not do that for some people. Some people might be oblivious to it, but other people might have issues with that. So observational studies often actually do include more subtle observations. People are being followed, where you sort of try to observe something from a distance. So that's something I think for you to consider, or maybe have there been any other choices to do?
We did talk about using a LAPO or spy camera, whereby it's more covert, that they don't notice it. I mean, even if we use something which is subtle, based on some other researchers who have done similar studies, for example, Chantal, who used eye tracking in her study. She didn't sit next to the participant, but she sat somewhere far away. The participants still felt that it's not a natural context, and it's a limitation of the study that we have to acknowledge and address. Yeah, how that can be mediated or reduced would be making the participant comfortable with you. He knows what you're intending to do, having a brief idea. Basically making him feel at ease. In terms of interpretation of the data, maybe when at the start he might feel a bit uncomfortable because you're looking at him, but as he starts to tune in to tune out, it becomes background noise to him. That's one of the hypotheses that I have.
The other question I had was around the link between observational studies and interviews and the proprioceptive nature of your study. So you record body movement, taps and so on, and then you do an interview for participants to explain or link to those experiences. That's my understanding of it. If that's sort of pre-conscious to some extent, what is the ability for you to actually derive sort of meaning from that from participants? So if I respond to a particular sort of movement in the music, can I explain why that is? Do I remember exactly that I actually tapped my foot? Is it something that happens unconsciously? So how much of that can you actually cover in interviews?
So right now we haven't conducted the study yet. So at this point of time, it's just a conjecture that in terms of synchronization, we'll match it, we'll play the video, and have the participant, recall. There will be, of course, limitations like recall biases. This would be inevitable in the study. But in terms of meaning making and things like that, Laban movement analysis has been quite an established method in terms of engaging with music. And interestingly, some HDI researchers have actually started to use Laban movement indicators for interactions with technology. So that's I think it's an area of new growth for human-computer interactions.
Okay. The last question we get to methodology, that's really sort of around the second research questions and the use of the modalities that you're using. And to me, that's where I'm not really clear why this particular choice was made. So I can sort of understand the move from music to tactile interaction, but then we move to visual sort of aspects with a virtual reality headset. To me, that's sort of a little bit out of the blue. So I don't expect, we were talking about in music reception, we're talking about tangible aspects, and suddenly we're back in a visual visual domain, and even not just a visual one, an immersive visual one. So that's, to me, a large departure from what you were looking at before. So to some extent, how can technology mediate these experiences? The choices that were made there seem a little bit random in the sense with headphone, that makes sense, tangible, but then the VR is not really motivated. The fact that some people have done studies in that context is quite.
Well, what motivated it? It's basically I've noticed orchestras like Sir Simon Rattle conducting the Berlin Philharmonic in VR. So that was the motivation behind it, and that fed into what's got me started into this project right at the start. So well, I know that right now it seems that there's a little bit of a gap, talking about proprioception, but probably what I didn't mention at the start is proprioception, or emphasize, is proprioception is not just limited to haptic feedback, but it also involves how you integrate your seeing, hearing, feeling, and use it to orientate your sense of body or perception around in the space and time around you. So that's where I think it's not just one modality or the other, but how the person uses his body to integrate all these separate modalities into his experience.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for coming. And if you don't go too far, do you have a phone number or a text? Or
Yeah,
I don't
I have.
yeah, we'll just give you a quick text.